Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
No.
Hello.
I'm still walking into the lab here, but
Okay.
how's everybody doing?
Good. Good. So this week we had a DevoWorm meeting, and that was pretty good. You can go see the meeting on the YouTube channel for DevoWorm. Then we also had an open source meeting yesterday. And that meeting was basically updates for people working on projects, a lot of information about the DevoGraph repository. There was some interest in the Hugging Face Spaces, which is a nice tool. It's sort of a parallel to GitHub in some ways, because you can store files there, store your models. But also it gives you this new community of people to spread your model to. So this is a machine learning AI community where people are looking for open source models. So we had, I was looking at how it's structured, and I had forgotten that it was by project. So there's a DevoLearn one, and I created one for DevoGraph. So if you're interested in joining the Hugging Face Spaces, ask for permission, and then I can grant it. So yeah, I don't know. Well, this week coming up is the Active Inference live stream. I think on Wednesday, around midday in North America. It's on the open source economics of open source. And so I think we talked about that in last week's open source meeting. So that's going to be happening this week.
Yeah, what kind of speakers?
I'm not sure who the presenters are for it, but it's a paper by an external group. So they're just kind of talking about, and I imagine it just gets framed in an active inference context. People thinking about the problem in that way. They do a lot of stuff with like, they do a lot of stuff with like, I don't know, like I don't want to say cryptocurrency, but a similar thing, blockchain, and they have like a project on that. So that might go in that direction, or something about just pure active inference. I'm not really sure which.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, and then that's the Active Inference Institute. They have their YouTube channel, and you can join in on that stream. They always have streams, like almost every day. They seem to come out. So that's for Active Inference. So I guess I should start with this paper that came out. It was from Apple Research. It was called The Illusion of Thinking, and it came out, I think, in the past 2 weeks. So this paper, The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. So we've been talking about these chain of thought models and large language models, and also large reasoning models, and how those kind of differ from large language models and get you to a place where you have more in-depth reasoning, as opposed to like just regurgitating tokens or whatever. So we've talked about how people have used reinforcement learning for that, how people are doing other sorts of things. And in this paper, they're arguing that those types of models also have limitations, which might actually preclude them from being useful for thinking through a problem. So that's what they're doing. And this is a group of researchers at Apple Research. So they just put Apple on the paper as the affiliation, and you know what it is. Okay. And I think this was from the arXiv. It's been passed around, so maybe they're publishing it on their research website too. But anyways, you can imagine it's getting a lot of attention. So why don't we go through the abstract? This has direct relevance to a lot of the newer ChatGPT models or the OpenAI models where, they have this sort of reasoning component in them. So the abstract reads, recent generations of frontier language models have introduced large reasoning models, or LRMs, that generate detailed thinking processes before providing answers. While these models demonstrate improved performance on reasoning benchmarks, their fundamental capabilities, scaling properties, and limitations remain insufficiently understood. Current evaluations primarily focus on established mathematical encoding benchmarks, emphasizing final answer accuracy. However, this evaluation paradigm often suffers from data contamination and does not provide insights into the reasoning's traces and structure and quality. So we talked about those kind of, I'm going to call them circuit tracing tools, but something similar where you're tracing out how the model arrived at an answer, and you can trace it out neuron by neuron if necessary, or unit by unit. And so this gives you this, we have this way of evaluating the answer somewhat, although it's not clear how exactly the thing is being assembled, the answer is being assembled. We also have these benchmarks that people lean on to say, look, we've made great progress in this area. And then the question is, of course, are these coding benchmarks useful for larger applications? So, it's kind of, if you were to compare two models, you might be able to use a coding benchmark and find sort of the better performing model. But if you're comparing it with a cognitive agent or even a cognitive model it's actually less obvious from using a coding benchmark what the better, or if it's matching the abilities of a cognitive agent. Okay, in this work, we systematically investigate these gaps with the help of controllable puzzle environments that allow precise manipulation of compositional complexity while maintaining consistent logical structure. So these controllable puzzle environments, these are things that people use in cognitive science. So you'll see some examples of that with like the Tower of Hanoi, for example, where you're given this puzzle where you have to move these rings from one rung to another, but you have to stack them in order from largest on the bottom to smallest on top. And you have to transfer them according to certain rules so that you end up at the end of the puzzle with satisfying the conditions of the game. So this is where you can test, thinking, how you reason out a problem in multiple steps. Because it takes multiple steps to get this sort of answer in a reasonable amount of time. And so you can count the number of steps it takes to do this, and you can examine the process by which this reasoning unfolds. And they talk about compositional complexity, and given our discussion on compositionality, that's interesting. Because remember, compositionality is putting together an answer. We're putting together a complex behavior, or putting together a sentence in this case, or in the case of like what the linguists think about. So as compositional complexity is, you're able to sort of modify different stages in the reasoning process or constrain it in certain ways, and then get an answer at the end and examine how the answer was arrived at. This setup enables the analysis of not only final answers, but also the internal reasoning traces. So remember, we're interested in what the model is doing internally, not necessarily the output behavior, although the output behavior is important. If the output behavior is matching that of a cognitive model, but the reasoning trace is quite different, Well, that's interesting because, we don't have the same process going on. The model could just reproduce the behavior, but it could just be like an imitation or something like that. So we want to know like how it's arriving at this. What is the way in which it's reasoning? Okay, so this offers insights into how large reasoning models think, in quotes, because we don't know if they actually think or what thinking actually means. And hold that thought because that's something that will come up later. Their extensive experimentation across diverse puzzles, we show that frontier LRMs face a complete accuracy collapse beyond certain complexities. So this is interesting. Now, I guess that by frontier large reasoning models, they mean the state-of-the-art models that we see out of OpenAI and other big, large companies, very large models. And so this is interesting because you can provide it with a very simple puzzle and it's pretty accurate. It can like put together an answer, but at some point it does not do that very well, or it's very inaccurate. So this actually, kind of feeds into this idea of, why and how do models hallucinate? Or why and how do models kind of get things wrong? How do they go off course? And so this may be a case where if you get to a certain level of complexity, and if you're doing things like assembling a bunch of sentences, it may not reveal itself. But if you're trying to do something more complex, like understand the reasoning behind, say, a passage of text, then that may be too complex for the model to deal with. Moreover, they exhibit a counterintuitive scaling limit. Their reasoning effort increases with the problem complexity up to a point. So as the problem complexity increases, the reasoning effort increases. The model puts more effort into reasoning, comes up with greater and greater explanations, then declines despite having an adequate token budget. So there's this budget of tokens that it has, so it can use those tokens to arrive at these answers. It can devote some of that budget towards solving problems. The problem complexity increases, so the challenge to the model to spend that token budget on generating, more elaborate reasoning increases. But then, despite having enough of a token budget, they stop at some point. And so it's not a resource constraint, it's something else. By comparing LRMs with their standard large language model counterparts under equivalent inference compute, we identify 3 performance regimes. So they're comparing here these large reasoning models with large language models. Okay, so they have these 2 ways of sort of building a large language model. We have just the standard vanilla language model and then the reasoning model. And we're comparing those. We identify 3 performance regimes: low complexity tasks, where standard models surprisingly outperform large reasoning models. So this is where you have very low levels of complexity, and you might expect large language models to do well there. They tend to outperform large reasoning models. Maybe it's just because that's their regime, and large reasoning models maybe are trying to do too much and it hurts their performance. The second is medium complexity tasks, where additional thinking in large reasoning models demonstrates advantage. So this is where we have medium level complexity, where we have to add additional thinking and add additional effort. And large reasoning models take over. And then 3 high complexity tasks, where both models experience complete collapse. So this is where we're in this high complexity domain and both models collapse for reasons that we're not quite sure of. we found that large reasoning models have limitations in exact computation. They fail to use explicit algorithms and reason inconsistently across puzzles. So they don't necessarily generate algorithms to solve the problem. They kind of do this ad hoc, which makes it harder to study and harder to understand why they do this. They don't generate explicit algorithms, however. So, this is, of course, you could think of generating a specific or an explicit algorithm as kind of like generating a hypothesis or a formal hypothesis. If you present the model with a problem, can it reason out several hypotheses to test? So the formality of the methods aren't there. And then they reason inconsistently across puzzles. So this is, of course, linked to this because they're not generating these formal solutions or these formal candidate solutions. And so the reasoning is inconsistent. We also investigate the reasoning traces in more depth, studying the patterns of explored solutions and analyzing the model's computational behavior, shedding light on their strengths, limitations, and ultimately raising crucial questions about their true reasoning capabilities. So as you can imagine, this is pretty controversial, and it's not clear what this means, but we'll see that there's been a lot of speculation on what it means. And even people who are kind of highly critical of it. So this is not to say that, this is not the be-all, end-all of this debate. It's, kind of dependent on what you're throwing at the models and how you're testing it. So, but I want to create a chart here. So the first chart is thinking about these levels of complexity. So we have low, medium, and high. So we have medium. And for the sake of argument, just say this is maybe like, well, they did say that this was compositional complexity. And not really sure what they mean by compositional complexity. We'll probably have a definition later. And then, of course, we have our space here where cases medium and high. High. And we said that in low, LLMs outperform large reasoning models. And then in medium, large reasoning models outperform large language models. And then in both cases, large reasoning models, large language models collapse. Okay, so I just wanted to put that on the table because we'll probably come back to this. Okay, so let's get into the paper here. So they talk about large language models having recently evolved to include specialized variants explicitly designed for reasoning tasks, and these are our large reasoning models. Examples include OpenAI's O1 and O3, DeepSeek R1, which we talked about in depth a couple weeks ago, Claude 3.7, and Gemini Thinking. So these are all, I guess Gemini Thinking is just Gemini. And so, this introduces this new artifact characterized by their thinking mechanisms, such as long chain of thought with self-reflection, and have demonstrated promising results across reasoning benchmarks. Their emergence suggests a potential paradigm shift in how large language systems approach complex reasoning and problem-solving tasks, with some researchers proposing them as significant steps towards more general artificial intelligence capabilities. So, despite these claims and performance advancements, their fundamental benefits and limitations remain insufficiently understood. So we have some critical questions that persist. And I mean persist, they've been out for like about a year at most. So, The first is, are these models capable of generalizable reasoning, or are they leveraging different forms of pattern matching? So is it that they're going through this reasoning process, or are they just simply imitating what they see in the training data and doing a lot of pattern matching that is impressive, but it isn't reasoning? So you want to have that sort of, you want to test for the false positive of reasoning. The second is, how does their performance scale with increasing problem complexity? So that's what we just drew an image of on the board. 3, how do they compare to their non-thinking standard large language model counterparts when provided with the same inference token compute? So again, we have this budget of tokens. We have these large language models that have, we give them the same budget of tokens. And the idea is that they're maybe supposed to be more efficient with their tokens or reach a higher level of reasoning with the same amount of tokens. And so that's what they want to test, and they want to see how that compares to standard large language models. Most importantly, however, what are the inherent limitations of current reasoning approaches, and what improvements might be necessary to advance towards more robust reasoning capabilities? And so, one of the things they need to do is come up with a good evaluation paradigm. So this figure here is kind of a summary of what they were doing. So this is figure 1. So they want to enable verification of both final answers and intermediate reasoning traces. So they want to be able to analyze model thinking behavior. So on the upper left-hand side of figure 1, we pose to the model, we pose this case of the Tower of Hanoi. And so this is the response of the large language model, and it gives a strategy for solving the Tower of Hanoi. And it gives the number of moves and their composition. So you have, so on the upper right, we see the Tower of Hanoi. We see that there are 3 pegs, peg 0, peg 1, and peg 2. And the idea is that in the initial state, these different rings are on peg 1, or in peg 0, and the largest ring is on the bottom and the smallest ring is on the top, with an intermediate sized ring in the middle. And the idea is we need to move these rings across from peg 0 to peg 2, but keep them in the same order. So you can't just pick them all up one at a time and move them from peg 0 to peg 2 because they'd be inverted. The largest ring would be on the top. And so you have to use peg 1 as an intermediary. In other words, you need to take 1 or ring 1 and you need to store it on 1. You need to take ring 2 and store it on maybe 2, or maybe 1 as well. Take ring 3, move it over to 2. Take ring 2, move it back to 0. Take ring 1, move it. Well, see, that's the problem. Then you have to move 2 from 0 to 2 and then 1 from 1 to 2. I guess that's a good solution, just eyeballing. And so and they show an example here of how what the model is producing in terms of an answer maps to the problem space. So you have this initial state, this middle state, and a target state. And it just generates the sequence of moves that it needs to make to get to that target state. So it composes sort of a final answer from what it's presented with, from the puzzle. And the reasoning trace, of course, is apparent here. You see the different moves, but you actually don't see why it made those moves. It might just be that it saw an example in the psychology literature and it just copied that and gave an answer. So is it actually going through these moves? And it can produce an optimal move, but it's not like when a artificial model plays chess and they generate strategies and moves and things like that, and they can beat a human expert. We're talking about something where the model is maybe putting together an answer, but it's really mimicking what's in the training set. So if this is a fairly easy problem to solve, there might be an example of it in the world somewhere. It's just copying, as opposed to, say, coming up with a unique strategy and being able to walk through each implementation of that strategy and say, oh, this is why this was done. It's unconventional, but it's a very interesting move. And so, this is where it's not quite clear that the language models are actually doing the latter. So they're extracting the moves from thoughts for analysis, and then they're extracting the final answer for measuring accuracy. So they want to see if the model actually completed the puzzle, and then, and how many moves and how accurate was it given the number of moves it committed. And then they want to extract all the moves to analyze to see if those moves are kind of in an order that is sort of a realistic way of solving it. Okay, yeah. Vidhi says Tower of Hanoi classic recursion example. Yes, it's a very simple example of recursion, and then they use this, of course, in a lot of cognitive science experiments to sometimes in development, sometimes in adults, to look at reasoning and study that. So you're trying, it's not an obvious answer. You need to track multiple things in your head and figure out how to get from point A to point B. So these are the results here at the bottom. These are graphs show, well, the first one shows accuracy as a percentage versus complexity, and the way they're measuring complexity is the number of disks. So this example shows 3 disks, which you can do in your head, and a large language model probably can do pretty easily, at least generating an answer. And it's not that hard. The complexity isn't that high. So you can see in this graph that we have 3. So you have 1, 2, 3, which is in this yellow regime here. And in the yellow regime, Claude 3.7, which is sort of the standard LLM, which is in red, and then the Claude 3.7 with thinking, which is the LRM, which is in blue. They perform about the same on the task. So there's no difference there, which is interesting because, we can't really say whether it's actually coming up with a sort of a strategy on its own or if it's copying what it sees in the world, but it's a pretty easy thing to do. It's a pretty easy thing to generate. Then we have this blue regime from 3 disks to 10 disks. So this is where we're adding complexity, and we're not adding any more rungs. We're not adding any more rungs. We're just adding more things to move over. So you have to export a lot more moves and assemble or compose a much larger answer. And so this is where the thinking model, where the LRM exceeds the large language model by quite a bit. You can see that the large reasoning model maintains its accuracy over 60% until disk 8, whereas the large language model falls off at disk 4 to below 40% accuracy. And then, of course, after 10, we have this third regime, which is the pink regime, and that is where there's a total collapse of accuracy. And for both types of models, you get under 20%. So this is interesting. They have these regimes of complexity. So you have from 1 to 3, from 3 to 10, and from 10 to 20 as they test it. So if we look at we can create a graph here where we have, again, this regime, I guess it's, okay, in terms of accuracy, 20, 10, 3, we have accuracy as a percent, and we have these 3 regimes. So this is where you have your large reasoning models, which have this sort of preservation in the middle, and then the large language models, which kind of show a premature collapse. So LLM, LRM. All right, so that's our kind of how we can think of accuracy versus complexity. Now, the next graph is, of course, response length. So this talks about the token usage. So this is the token budget. And so we have, again, these three regimes of complexity going from 1 to 3, 3 to 10, and then 10 to 20. And so, again, this is our large language model. This is our large reasoning model. And our large reasoning model will use a lot more tokens. And then it'll stop using tokens. So this collapse isn't because it's using so many tokens it can't keep up. It's because it just stops doing anything. It stops making effort. And it holds true for the large language models and the large reasoning models. And I don't know, if we go down to the discussion, they might discuss why that is. But basically, there's this huge ramp up in token usage in this middle regime. Okay. So we go back over to our board. We have this graph where now we have token budget, I guess. So we have a graph here. 3, 10, 20. And we have our large language model here. It uses a few more tokens here, and then it collapses back down. And then our large reasoning models, there's a huge investment in the use of tokens here, and it collapses back down. And so this is the token budget. I'm actually really fascinated by this because I'm thinking in terms of I don't know if people are familiar with this old game called Core War, but this is a way that people have looked at how programs of different classes will use the computational budget available to them. So they'll use, some classes of agent will use different strategies to exploit the number of compute cycles in the CPU. And you can have these really interesting games where different classes of agent will compete against one another or form these sort of ecosystems where they all have their own sort of niche. And, it's not that that's what we're dealing with here, but we're dealing with a finite resource, which is this token budget, or I guess a semi-finite resource. And we're seeing how they use it in terms of kind of producing a solution or producing a competency, as Michael Levin might say. In this case, we don't get a competency. We get this collapse. So we get sort of this, no competency here, but we have maybe a semi-competency here. So it almost looks like you're going to develop some sort of reasoning here, and then you basically lose it at a certain budget or at a certain level of investment. Then we have complexity and position with thoughts or within thoughts. So I'm not sure what this means, but it, basically it looks at correct solutions versus incorrect solutions. So when we get to within this low level of complexity, we have more correct solutions and incorrect solutions. And then with the second medium regime, we get a lot more correct than incorrect solutions, and then that's where their tracking stops. So basically, I don't know if this is counterintuitive. You get more incorrect solutions within thoughts here, and then more correct solutions in this medium area of complexity. And I'm not sure if that has something to do with the token budget, but let's see if they say anything in the legend here. Oh, okay. Thinking tends to find answers early at low complexity and later at high complexity. So it's basically finding answers at a certain point in the chain of thought. In failed cases, it often fixates on an early wrong answer, wasting the remaining token budget. That's interesting. So it gets fixated on early wrong answers and spends all of its token budget, or spends a lot of its token budget on exploring that wrong answer. And that's, kind of a thing with human reasoning where people, we have this expression, cut our losses. So if you find something is maybe not a very good answer, you stop exploring that answer and you move to a new potential answer. And in this case, what the large language models are doing, or large reasoning models, they're fixating on one answer and they're not using that sort of principle. Both cases reveal inefficiencies in the reasoning process. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with here. And so let's see if we have any other thing. Okay, here. These are their key contributions as they see them. We question the current evaluation paradigms of large reasoning models on established math benchmarks. We show that the state of the art in large reasoning models still fail to develop generalizable problem-solving capabilities, with accuracy ultimately collapsing to zero. We find that there exists a scaling element in large reasoning models' reasoning effort with respect to problem complexity, evidenced by the counterintuitive decreasing trend in the thinking tokens after a complexity point. So this is where, again, we talked about that decrease with complexity. We question the current evaluation paradigm based on final accuracy and extend our evaluation to intermediate solutions of thinking traces with the help of deterministic puzzle simulators. Our analysis reveals that as problem complexity increases, correct solutions systematically emerge at later positions in thinking compared to incorrect ones. So this is where, you have to explore something for a while before you get to the correct solution. And what the language models are doing is kind of not understanding that long term of reasoning and just kind of thinking, oh, this is the right answer, definitely the right answer, and we'll explore that to its logical conclusion. Whereas, maybe humans playing this puzzle might explore the model, they might explore the puzzle, and then oh, okay, I get it now. They come up with this sort of aha moment of getting the right answer at some point after playing with it for a while. And then we uncover surprising limitations in large reasoning models' ability to perform exact computation, including their failure to benefit from explicit algorithms and their inconsistent reasoning across puzzle types. Okay. So they kind of also unpack this whole sort of these trends that we were talking about. So first, despite their sophisticated self-reflection mechanisms learned through reinforcement learning, so these are the large reasoning models, and we talked about how you basically have this large language model with this reinforcement learning step on top. And the idea is that, the self-reflection is the reinforcement learning. So you have the generated answers, and then you have this sort of reinforcement that gives you this ability to self-reflect and get rewarded for the proper sort of self-reflections. And so this is, thought to be sort of I guess you could call it a stopgap for the lack of reasoning that a large language model might have. But despite the second level, or the second layer, these models fail to develop generalizable problem-solving capabilities for planning tasks, with performance collapsing to zero beyond a certain complexity threshold. And then, of course, when you compare large reasoning models and large language models under equivalent inference compute, which just means, I guess, that they have the same compute power and the same token budget, it reveals three distinct reasoning regimes. For simple, lower compositional problems, standard large language models demonstrate greater efficiency and accuracy. As problem complexity moderately increases, however, thinking models gain an advantage. However, when problems reach high complexity with longer compositional depth, both model types experience complete performance collapse. Notably near this collapse point, and you can think of this collapse point as sort of like a phase transition or something like that, large reasoning models begin reducing their reasoning effort. measured by inference time tokens as problem complexity increases despite operating well below generation length limits. This suggests a fundamental inference timescaling limitation in large reasoning models' reasoning capabilities relative to the problem complexity. So that's interesting. It may be a timescaling limit that we're dealing with. So as we move out in terms of the number of tokens here, we actually have a time length. So like these are, of course, I'm sorry, not number of tokens, but number of moves, or number of disks, translating in the number of moves. This is a time parameter as well as sort of a complexity parameter. So this is where we're moving forward in time, and this is taking longer and longer as you're adding disks. So from 3 disks to 10 disks, 10 disks to 20 disks, and you're adding time into that problem. Okay. Finally, our analysis of intermediate reasoning traces or thoughts reveals complexity-dependent patterns. In simpler problems, reasoning models often identify correct solutions early, but inefficiently continue exploring alternatives, incorrect alternatives, and overthinking phenomena. So they're overthinking the problem, or they're overthinking some of these incorrect alternatives. It's like, don't overthink the problem. It's a very simple answer. And so you, being very conscientious, develop this very complex hypothesis and you explore it to its extent, and you continue to be wrong because you can't rescue the hypothesis. It has like a fatal flaw, or in this case, the strategy is a fatal flaw. And part of reasoning is identifying when there's a fatal flaw and either fixing that fatal flaw or moving on to something else. So that's what they're talking about overthinking. At moderate complexity, correct solutions emerge only after extensive exploration of incorrect paths. So these are, of course, again, they're not like fixing this at moderate complexity. It's just that they're investing a lot of tokens in kind of exploring these alternatives alongside the correct or correct strategies, and they're able to maintain a higher level of performance just simply by having a lot of things that they're doing. So they're dumping everything into their token budget here. They're maintaining this. Remember, the accuracy falls in this middle regime, but not as much as in large language models. So that reasoning step, that reinforcement learning step, is doing the work of keeping the accuracy up. Okay, so they're using tokens to mask its loss of performance. And then when you reach a certain level of complexity, that just collapses entirely. Okay. This indicates large reasoning models possess limited self-correction capabilities that, while valuable, reveal fundamental inefficiencies and clear scaling limitations. Okay, so we did these points. They talk about some of the existing benchmarks, these math and puzzle environments. So they actually did a number of puzzle environments. They did the Tower of Hanoi, which is this model we talked about. They did checkers jumping, which is maybe a more conventional test of strategy. River crossing, where you have to get things across the river in multiple steps. And then blocks world, where you have to move things from one side of the screen to the other in terms of moving these blocks in a certain order. And so this is all kind of like, you have these multi-step problems. You have to kind of come up with these long chains of strategy that fit together. You have to compose a strategy out of these discrete moves. That's basically what we're doing here. Okay, so then they talk about what happens inside the thoughts of reasoning models. And so they conducted a fine-grained analysis of the reasoning traces. And so they showed their puzzle setup in figure 1. And they extract and analyze the intermediate solutions explored within the model, within the thoughts of a model, with the help of puzzle simulators. Our investigation examines patterns and characteristics of these intermediate solutions, their correctness relative to their sequential position in the reasoning process, and how these patterns evolve with increasing problem complexity. So they focused on the reasoning traces of Claude 3.7 sonnet thinking across their puzzle suite. For each intermediate solution identified within the traces, we recorded one, its relative position within the reasoning trace. So this is normalized by total thought length. So basically, you have this long reasoning trace that comes out. You figure out where things happened, in what position. Its correctness is validated by our puzzle simulator. So is this a correct answer, or is this a correct move, or is this a optimal move of some type? And then 3, the complexity of the corresponding problem. So how complex is the problem? So that allowed them to characterize the progression and accuracy of the solution throughout the reasoning process. So this figure 7 here shows kind of this reasoning trace. So we saw the tools for sort of tracing things through a neural network in I think 2 weeks ago maybe, or 1 week ago. This is showing something else. This is showing the output behavior and kind of tracing through this chain of strategies and assembling them in a certain way. So this on the left is the Tower of Hanoi, or on the upper left is the Tower of Hanoi. The bottom left is Blocks World. The upper right is checker jumping, and the lower right is river crossing. So we're looking at figure 7A. We're looking at these 4 graphs. And then on the right in figure 7B, we're looking at the Tower of Hanoi specifically and looking at these chains of length. So from n equals 1 to n equals 10. And then we're looking at solution accuracy versus position and thinking. So let's start with the Tower of Hanoi. We track the incorrect solutions and the correct solutions. So as we move along, we get, so the position and thinking, I guess, goes from 0 to 1. This is normalized. The correct answer goes down in the position and then back up. And the incorrect position and thinking goes up, down, and then down. So it becomes like at a lower, the incorrect answer is lower in terms of its position. The correct answer is higher in terms of its position for Tower of Hanoi. So they kind of cross at a complexity of 4 disks. In Blocks World, we're dealing with blocks instead of disks. And in this case, the position of thinking doesn't really change that much, with the correct answer coming a little bit later in the position than the incorrect answer. River crossing, I'm not sure what's going on with that, but I guess the incorrect answer is relatively late in the position of thinking. And then checker jumping is where, again, there's no crossing of the correct and incorrect answers. The correct answer comes later than the incorrect answer in its position of thinking. And so this just shows across these different examples. And it says that simple problems for, okay, so let's see. So if we go to, I guess the right is figure 7B. So for figure 7B, solution accuracy versus position and thinking is shown for the Tower of Hanoi at different complexity levels. Simple problems, which again is that regime of 1 to 3 units, show early accuracy declining over time, which is indicative of overthinking. Moderate problems, which are N4 through 7, show slight improvement in accuracy with continued reasoning and complex problems. And then in this case, more than 8 disks or a complexity of greater than 8 or greater to or equal than 8 exhibit consistently near 0 accuracy indicating complete reasoning failure. So you can see here that, like, we have from n equals 1 to n equals 10, we have this position and thinking in terms of tokens, and we have like these shallower sort of chains for smaller problem sets, and then longer chains for larger problem sets. And you can see that basically as the problem set gets longer, the position and thinking is, the accuracy is generally low, but it's really low once you get past, I don't know, 1,000 tokens, or maybe 4,000 tokens. So you can see that there's this kind of collapse. This is a kind of a hard graph to interpret. But in that case, you can see what happens there. So again, they give some open questions about this puzzling behavior. And, they kind of talk about some of this. And then they have this conclusion, which is in this paper, we systematically examine frontier large reasoning models through the lens of problem complexity using controllable puzzle environments. Our findings reveal fundamental limitations in current models. And they talk about the overthinking. They talk about some of these surprising results on large reasoning models that lead to several open questions for future work. Most notably, we observed their limitations in performing exact computation. For example, when we provided the solution algorithm for the Tower of Hanoi to the models, their performance on this puzzle did not improve, which is interesting because you would think if you gave them the algorithm that they would just copy the algorithm, but that's not actually what happened. The implication here is that there's no use of an algorithm. It's just generating these strategies independent of an algorithm and independent of any sort of systematic thinking, or so it seems. Moreover, investigating the first failure move of the models revealed surprising behaviors. For instance, they could perform up to 100 correct moves in the Tower of Hanoi, but fail to provide more than 5 correct moves in the river crossing puzzle. So it's not really dependent on complexity, it's just the type of game. And so the Tower of Hanoi seems to be better, or it seems to be better at Tower of Hanoi than river crossing, for whatever reason. We believe our results can pave the way for future investigations in the reasoning capabilities of this system. So again, this result of Tower of Hanoi versus river crossing is important because it's not based on complexity per se. It's based on the sort of the structure of the game, or the structure of the puzzle. Now, I wanted to get into a few more things. Actually, Morgan, if you wanted to make some comments here.
Well, it's as you know, this paper generated a lot of strong feelings in the machine learning community, or I should say the reasoning models community. And so it's interesting to hear. I mean, thanks for going over this because all I really caught was all the social media around it.
Oh yeah.
And did they release? This was, I think, part of because it was Apple's developer conference.
Oh yeah, WWDC. Yes.
And so there's also a lot of there's a lot of like Apple. Apple's essentially absent from kind of AI work, right? And how much is this like when Apple rolled out, it was like Apple is a ruthless multinational, like all of them, right? And yet like somehow they've managed to have this this kind of privacy exemption in terms of people's minds,
right.
and of course, like this is just how do you undercut your competitors, right? So it's just like like we're gonna cut off Facebook's data flow from our customers, right? Not as some, but we'll market it as like, hey, we're doing you guys all a big favor, right? It's simultaneously they start selling that exact same data stream,
right.
Like we're just not giving it to Facebook first.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is funny, right? Like, like a lot of, I mean, Miles Brundage is this one guy. I don't know if I'm getting his last name right. Anyway, I don't even know who he works for now, like OpenAI or something.
Yeah.
But he was a fellow at Oxford for some time period, and we commiserated about the lack of burritos there. And anyway, like his comments about this were like, it's a good, it's they're not saying anything that other people haven't said,
right?
but for some reason he was criticizing their rollout or presentation or something like that.
Yeah.
And it seemed like that there was a lot of anyway. Point being that, like, it is super interesting. Arc 2 is still like the go-to benchmark, right?
Yeah.
And I think 03 is the considered the frontier edge in terms of performance across arc tasks.
Yeah.
Something like that, right? And yeah, so it was interesting. It was just like to get past the multinationals fighting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting in terms of just like, what do they add to the story beyond Anthropic's, the what you presented last time around, or like, was it a couple weeks ago, in terms of like Anthropic circuits and again, like Anthropic's entire case and sorry, who do they actually represent? Are they Amazon?
Yeah.
like again, like I was about to say, like Anthropic's an independent player, but not really.
Yeah.
But they've certainly tried to emphasize their explainability,
right?
Or and so that was interesting, and the trade-offs that you were discussing was also interesting, and I guess it makes me it's like at a certain point it's definitely worth diving into these models a bit more, and I just there's some new stuff. I don't know if I've posted it here, but just in terms of audio tokenization, and which is of course kind of the same thing as same time series tokenization.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
and like like again, like I still don't know if we're looking at reasoning.
Yeah.
But again, like complex forecasting.
Right. Yeah.
Like how does that differ from planning?
Yeah.
But they seem powerful, and they seem to be as stretched at a point now, or developed to a point now where there's certainly really interesting engineering going on that's worth understanding. So anyway,
Yeah.
more stuff to study, David.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Apple kind of like, they're struggling with Apple Intelligence. So like they just say, well, look, this is why. And
I mean, well, yeah, and it's just like they're still. I mean, it's funny because it's just like they still haven't even gotten Siri to be Alexa. You know, like they are. I don't know what. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad that I am not following what the developer rollout was. Or, what their foundation model strategy, foundation model integration with OS strategy is. I will say it's I know it's going to be an issue for Fedora too. Certainly IBM is trying to push Red Hat to adopt it, again, this is the buzzword of the decades.
Yeah.
So somehow integrating this is what OS manufacturers are supposed to be working on.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and again, I think that you mentioned that you found the trade-offs interesting. I do too.
I thought that was that was something, right? And it speaks, again, there's that's it's saying something about your kind of planning ahead window, or I mean, the work on this reasoning these reasoning models is certainly interesting, and but hopefully more work connecting it, more work like this, more work. I mean, again, this just strikes me as somewhat Gary Marcus-ish.
Oh yeah.
Or Emily Bender-ish.
They had mentioned that about the Gary Marcus. I don't know if he put up a blog post on this, but I think it's definitely in his wheelhouse. I don't have it up.
No, yeah. Does he say something like, "Hey, this is what I've been saying"?
Yeah, I think it would tend to be like, "And I told you so." So I didn't really want to get into that, but
I know. I didn't feel like reading another Schmidt humor. Yes. Well, still good.
Yeah.
I wonder what is this taking over CogSci literature? We've looked at LingBuzz, LingBuzz, like the Ling archive for linguistics, and how much these models have somewhat, or at least that one paper dominated. Is this also sucking all the oxygen from CogSci yet?
Oh, I'm sure it probably is to some extent, but well, I mean, sucking the oxygen meaning everyone's fascinated by it.
Well, that either if you're a CogSci researcher, if you're not looking at parallels between LLMs and humans,
right,
that you're passé,
right. Oh yeah, I'm sure they probably are, because this is kind of looking maybe 20 years ago between robots and humans or something like that. Although it's not as high, it wasn't as hyped, I have to say. So
yeah.
So yeah, that'd be interesting to see how CogSci is integrating this kind of research, because it's definitely, like I said, this is very CogSci oriented. You could learn direct parallels between how humans perform on, or in development, how children perform on Taurophonoi versus adults and see that kind of, that progression of a set of strategies or a way of thinking. And
I mean, but I mean, is this an artifact though that they've trained on our language?
what do you mean?
Well, like, I mean, again, it's they're foundation models, right? So it's come first from training on language prediction, and certainly, which suggests a, not necessarily a world model in the sense of like outside, but like that you've generated this model about language for generative model for language.
Yeah.
And so anyway.
Yeah, the training aspect is interesting because, like I said, you could have like this is not like an unknown puzzle. Like this has been solved in, say, like in the literature. They talk about how people solve it. So if you train your model on like Coxeye papers, there it is. There's the answer. But would you be able to get independent solutions or really interesting, like, in chess, there's always this innovation to kind of figure out strategies, and sometimes they look really weird, but they're effective. And it's like no one knows exactly why or how people came up with this. It's just the pressure to win or the pressure to do well, and then say, okay, well, let's throw everything we know out and let's try this new strategy. I don't know if you see that here, but like that would be kind of, to me, a hallmark of like, oh yeah, this thing maybe really is thinking about.
Yeah. I did they mention the ARC prize or the ARC challenge directly?
I don't
mean,
think so. Yeah.
like, it is. I don't know if you saw this, but I think I put it in Data Sci ML. But it was a machine learning street talk talking about the company's gaming, like LLM arena. Is that what it's called? Or it's like an arena benchmark,
okay.
and the basically like people using metrics, starting to game whatever system that you're trying to judge them by,
right?
Because billions of dollars are there are prizes at the end of this rainbow.
Yeah.
Right. And so I mean I would say like if anything, like Apple wasn't harsh enough in that beginning part.
Yeah.
In terms of, it's not just data contamination or like yeah, it's not just that you might be training on something that's relevant. It's that your benchmarks are gameable in various ways, and that's what the machine learning street talk video is about. Was like ways in which people have figured out how you can iterate on the benchmark itself. Yeah, but that's not but again, that's definitely not reasoning. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, but like, and then how much the art goes out of its way to make sure that its tests are not public, or
yeah, it's like avoid like looking at the test before you take it, basically.
Like again, like certainly actively trying to be ungameable.
Right.
Anyway, it's still the benchmark to be.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, this was, of course. So yeah, as you mentioned, this was, of course, kind of contentious. The Illusion of Thinking. And so this title, The Illusion of Thinking, was sort of mocked in this response paper, The Illusion of the Illusion of Thinking. This is a comment on this paper we just saw. This was published on the arXiv like this week, I think.
And, that's funny.
Yeah, so this is so this paper that we just looked at, Shoje et al., report that large reasoning models exhibit accuracy collapse on planning puzzles beyond certain complexity thresholds. We demonstrate that their findings primarily reflect experimental design limitations rather than fundamental reasoning failures. So their analysis reveals three critical issues. Tower of Hanoi experiments systematically exceeded model output token limits at reported failure points, with models explicitly acknowledging these constraints in their outputs. Then two, the author's automated evaluation frameworks failed to distinguish between reasoning failures and practical constraints, leading to misclassification of model capabilities. And then three, their river crossing benchmarks include mathematically impossible instances for n equal to or greater than 6 due to insufficient boat capacity, yet models are scored as failures for not solving these unsolvable problems. And so when we control for these experimental artifacts by requesting generating functions instead of exhausted move lists, preliminary experiments across multiple models indicate high accuracy on Tower of Hanoi instances previously reported as complete failures. These findings highlight the importance of careful experimental design. So I don't know what they're doing here in terms of like, I guess they're doing, they're kind of walking through some of these things that they mentioned. So the consequences of rigid evaluation, physical token limits drive apparent collapse, and alternative representations restore performance. And then reevaluating complexity claims, so thinking about how complex the problem actually is. And so then future work should design evaluations that distinguish between reasoning capability and output constraints, verify puzzle solvability before evaluating model performance. 3, using complexity metrics that reflect computational difficulty, not just solution length. 4, consider multiple solution representations to separate algorithmic understanding from execution. And so the question isn't whether large reasoning models can reason, but whether our evaluations can distinguish reasoning from typing. And I guess this is just kind of thinking about, that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That makes a lot of sense now. Certain social media posts make more sense given that. like that's okay. I see what they were getting at when they said like they pointed out flaws to the authors. And yeah, okay. It still seems. I mean, I still want to have a better engineering understanding of the token context size and its role in these evaluations.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things they're suggesting too is that if you run the model enough times, it might generate instances where it actually solves the problem instead of collapsing. So it's like if you get into that latter regime, it may be harder to generate a correct instance, but you can solve it. It's just that it's less like reliable. I think that may be kind of what may be happening there, or that it's not. Yeah, I mean it's obviously going to be harder because it's a more they have to do more, generate more to get to the answer. So it's not going to maybe always get the right answer, but it can get the right answer. Much like in humans when you're faced with a really hard puzzle, or like if you have maybe only a few people in the world that can solve a Rubik's Cube. When you scramble it up and you say, solve this in a minute. And how many people can do that? Not a lot. I mean, we all have reasoning capabilities, but some people can do it very, they can become competent in that or are competent in that. And a lot of people could never be competent in that for whatever reason. It's just not something they're going to be able to do. Or maybe if they train enough, but if they train enough, you have to really kind of train just at that thing. So,
yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So definitely a lot of cognitive science here that's interesting, and not just like computer science.
Mm-hmm.
Not a
I mean,
huge.
these are to some extent, yeah, like you're saying, like these are interesting alternative cog-sci model.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm not a huge fan of Reddit, but like here it is. Well, you'll see what I mean. This is on our local llama. This is Apple's new research paper on the limitations of thinking models. And so this is kind of goes through this paper and some of the comments. So, it kind of talks about the brief takeaway of well, for Chromex anyways, a brief takeaway, a number of points. Regular models beat thinking models on simple tasks. Thinking models beat regular models on medium complexity tasks. Both types of models suffer from high complexity tasks, even at short prompt length. Thus, no relevant long context degradation impact. Thinking models allocate more reasoning tokens with increased task complexity, yet at some point start reducing them, and thus result quality suffers. Models tend to stick to wrong early answers, which aligns with the multi-turn research. I don't know what that is, but there's this multi-turn getting lost in multi-turn conversation. I guess this is where the model has to take turns in conversation, which is a form of improvisation. And so that, I don't know too much about that, but I guess that's kind of consistent with that. And then problem solving doesn't generalize. They can be doing okay in some puzzles, yet utterly fail in others, despite no increase in difficulty. And so this person here, Sky Feisty Llama 8, says, with the problem solving doesn't generalize, the AI believer's answer would be to increase generalization until the model can answer anything and everything. I think we're starting to see the limitations of a transformer architecture to encode human knowledge. It only works for finding similar patterns, but isn't capable of intellectual leaps like those aha moments, like we said. Not yet, anyway. And then this person, Seasoned Curlies, again, I didn't make up these screen names. It makes me wonder whether there's value in trying to train models and find and apply known algorithms correctly. As a teacher, I know that there's variance among students on their ability to apply step-by-step problem solving effectively. So this is something in education that you try to get people to do. Even when given directions, people find this very hard. Perhaps there's room for teaching large language models metacognitive strategies. So we've talked about this, like metacognition, and talked about a lot of the aspects of how humans are not always good reasoners. We like to think it's a human attribute, but it's not something that comes easy, especially multi-step reasoning.
Yeah. I mean, this is again why like DeepSeek's paper was so interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Because it showed you what else they were doing.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's not just a transformer. Right. I mean, yeah. And just how hybrid these models are getting to specifically do well on this kind of like task set.
Yeah.
Right. sorry, can you go back to Reddit just real quick though?
Yeah.
Because you you, you missed Stuffity. Was it Stuffity
This one
Stuff?
here, yeah.
Siri is a 9,001 quadrillion. I mean, again, this is it's comments like this that make the internet a wonderful place.
Yes.
The comment after, alarms and timers, don't tell. Oh, priceless.
Yeah.
Yes. You can't gatekeep humor. Yeah. Like, here's a statement. Reddit made some good points.
Yes.
That's yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not going to go through the whole Reddit post, thankfully, but I think this is gives you some idea of how people are thinking about this, and it's social media, so take it with a grain of salt. And then of course there were a lot of social media posts. One I found interesting. This is Carl Bergstrom on Blue Sky. He's the author or one of the authors of the book Bullshit Machines, which is kind of how to think about large language models. And I just find that interesting. So he did a post on this paper, The Illusion of Thinking. So this is a short thread, and he says, my sense over the past 6 months or so is that chain of thought prompting is used in ChatGPT 0.3, improved substantially upon previous systems, such as ChatGPT 4.0, at least for certain tasks. But how revolutionary is it? The authors set out to assess systematically the reasoning ability of chain of thought systems in a structured domain. That's why they use logic puzzles that can be solved with recursive algorithms. So we talked about the Tower of Hanoi, where the riverboat crossing problem. These findings are interesting for a domain characterized by extremely simple puzzles. The basic models without COT do as well as or better than the COT models and use a lot less compute. However, for medium difficulty puzzles, COT dramatically outperforms basic, which we showed and talked about. But then as you get to difficult puzzles, COT fails as well. The thing is, they're only difficult puzzles if you try to brute force them. So this is the part about algorithms we were talking about. That algorithms allow you to find a strategy that's not a brute force strategy. So I could just brute force the thing, basically try every solution or something like that. But the algorithm is actually the thing that you want to see, because it says that you're reasoning out sort of this generalizable strategy that should work. So like a search algorithm, of course, doesn't just try to search everything one by one element. I mean, that's just, any agent can do that. You have to have some strategy where you, have a pile of tokens and you split it into parts, and then you search it for maybe the largest token or the most significant token, and you keep doing that recursively until you find a subset and then search that. And it's a way to sort of cut down on your complexity or make that complexity smaller, but then maintain your accuracy. And that's what it's not doing. And that may be what's going on in this regime here, the pink regime, is it's not applying an algorithmic solution, so it can't maintain that accuracy. It's just trying to brute force everything, and as a result, gets low accuracy. Even if it can solve it, it's not it's not something that can be applied every time or by every model. We talked about this where, I don't know how they're measuring accuracy, but basically, because you're measuring accuracy, you're including all the wrong answers with the right answers. So if you're just doing a brute force search, you're going to have a lot less success than if you did try to a focused algorithm where you could always find success and have a high accuracy. So, I mean, that's kind of a thinking, the kind of thinking here. It gets worse. Straight up give the COT model the algorithm and it can't implement it. So if you just give, so they talked about how if you give the model the algorithm, it can't implement it. Certain people will scream that they prompted it wrong, of course. Maybe there is a way to prompt it right, but even so, it's not promising that this ability is at best so prompt dependent. And so that's kind of, so what did we learn from all of this? I think the paper is devastating for the notion that these systems have general reasoning capacities in the sense of being able to develop and deploy simple algorithms to solve combinatorially different problems or difficult problems. To phrase it a different way, it is useful, though not particularly surprising, to know that for these recursive problems, it doesn't work out a general algorithm and apply it. I mean, no sort of no shit. It is a large language model, not a magic Bertrand Russell genie box. What we don't learn from this is whether the training sets from these systems are sufficiently rich and chain of thought prompting sufficiently powerful to allow them to, for example, solve mathematical problems of intermediate difficulty. Where by that I mean one that I could solve as a human, but would be a day's work. And of course, your level of expertise would have to be fairly high to do that. Proving most mathematical theorems is quite different from implementing a Tower of Hanoi algorithm to make without error the 1,000 moves you need to solve a tower with 10 disks. And so, this is, again, more comments about it and going through, some of the details here. What's interesting about this, too, is there was another paper that I didn't pull up. This is, that was another play on words. This is the illusion of thinking. And apparently there was another paper was the illusion of human thinking, which I don't know what that was about, but maybe it was about kind of considering human thought as, like we talked about, we think about humans as reasoning as that's one of the hallmarks of being human, but maybe humans aren't necessarily great at reasoning. And maybe there's a better way, if there were in evolution a better organism that did better reasoning. That's humans would not be considered the hallmark of reasoning, but we are what we have. So, and large language models are what they have for now. So, so I guess that's it. I want to.
No, I mean that gets at it, right? Is that again, it wasn't exactly machine learning street talk's point, but again, you can imagine that there's a real emphasis on getting an improvement across a set of benchmarks, or again, like some arena benchmark, and focusing on that, reporting that, um, but still leaving the models completely open to almost kind of trivial shortcomings, and that just completely belie this thought that the performance increase on benchmarks is reflective of more and more thinking, because that's what it's called, thinking, TM, right? like, and yeah. Anyway, we still need more, people calling bullshit. Especially when as what Machine Learning Street Talk's talking about, which is that, like, again, these are trillion-dollar companies that have everything, every reason to lie,
Right.
or
Yeah.
every reason to game.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So this was an interesting paper that came out this week. This is actually Maxwell Ramstead is an active inference person, and Sennesh has done some really interesting work on the brain and on allostasis. And I don't know if he's involved in active inference, but this has a very maybe active inference type flavor. It's on alignment and interpretability of models, and they're talking about this Affective-Taxis hypothesis. So this is about emotion. I guess Ellie's work on allostasis is largely on the affective nervous system, and so this should be a really interesting paper. This was on the arXiv published last month. So the abstract reads, AI alignment is a field of research that aims to develop methods to ensure that agents always behave in a manner aligned with or consistent with the goals and values of their human operators, no matter their level of capability. This paper proposes that an effectivist approach to the alignment problem, reframing the concepts of goals and values in terms of affective-taxis. And so a taxis is like a directional movement towards something or away from something. So we have all sorts of taxis in behavior: phototaxis, chemotaxis, thigmotaxis. I mean, you name the stimulus, and there's usually a taxis. And the idea is that, if you have, say, for example, phototaxis, it's like you have an agent and it's attracted or repulsed by light. It's kind of like the Bradenburg vehicles and some of the simple training models that they have for those, where you provide a source of light and then it provides this gradient through which the agent can either move towards or repulse away from. And so the idea of taxis is basically where they move towards or away from a resource. In this case, the resource is affective. So these goals and values are reframed in terms of affective-taxis, and explaining the emergence of affective valence by appealing to recent work in evolutionary developmental and computational neuroscience. We review the state of the art and, building on this work, propose a computational model of affect based on taxis navigation. We discuss evidence in a tractable model organism that our model reflects the aspects of biological taxis navigation. We conclude with the discussion of the role of affective-taxis in AI alignment. So this talks about artificial agents and how we've gotten more and more capabilities in them, and talking about AI alignment and how that focuses on ensuring that AI agents do behave consistently in this way, even if the absence of direct human supervision is the case. So we want to have, like, if we're doing reasoning, we want to have it aligned with human reasoning or human goals in the sense that it's not doing nefarious things or unethical things or whatever. Conventionally, since state-of-the-art agents are trained using reinforcement learning and accordingly optimize a reward, utility, or cost function over the state trajectories determined by their sequential decisions, AI alignment is focused largely on designing agents that share a reward or utility or cost function with their human operators. So the idea of modeling this is that the humans and the AI would share like some sort of reward function. And this, goes back to the reasoning models, because reasoning models use a reinforcement learning framework to achieve reasoning for chain of thought that involves some sort of, policy utility or policy reward. So those policies are based on sort of the same things we find in humans, And so we kind of see the results accordingly. And so I don't have any more to say about that. Just want to put that out there. Unfortunately, however, there are core obstacles that need to be overcome for this approach to get off the ground. So this is something that isn't achieved. It's just kind of the way people are thinking about this. As pointed out in early work on AI alignment and the related philosophy literature, while people's actions depend on the convolution of their values and beliefs, their values themselves depend solely on the ground truth state of affairs. This introduces interpretive ambiguity that potentially prevents explicit alignment. So there's this ambiguity, and this is interpretive ambiguity that, results from sort of people not always expressing their values and beliefs consistently. For example, depending on our beliefs, we might experience an elevated heart rate as either romantic attraction, which is positive, rewarding, and valued, or as an effect of physical exercise, which might be negative, costly, and valueless. So, it depends, the sort of the physiological response has different affective value. And so, you think about, like, for example, allostasis, you have a state that you sort of attain, maybe elevated heart rate. And why is your heart rate elevated? Well, it could be because you're in love, or because you've just been out running 5 miles, or maybe you watched a scary movie, and those are all different sort of meanings attached to those, or explanations maybe. What we really value, in the sense necessary for building aligned autonomous agents, cannot be estimated solely from behavior, because it depends on a combination of how behavioral outcomes impact our physical reward systems and how those reward systems measure the cognitive costs of updating our beliefs along the way. So, we make these decisions and thinking about how, these reward systems work, and that interacts with our beliefs. Mathematically, it is not possible to estimate the reward function of an agent based solely on observed behavior, because behavior is the convolution of beliefs and values. So this is where we're looking at, how those beliefs and values are conditional and how they can change with the context. Without independently knowing about a belief formation mechanism at play, it is not possible to estimate the reward function used by an agent. While we do not presently know what the exact belief formation mechanism that is implemented by the human brain, whatever it is, however, we can be almost certain it is not via the back propagation of errors. So this is where, we have, I guess, an analogy with the reasoning work, or the sort of the strategic work, in that we don't even really understand how humans arrive at these things. And so, trying to say, well, this is how humans do it. And because we do that just solely by observing behavior, we can't really understand how humans do things by observing behavior. I mean, that's the whole premise of, like, physiological measurement, especially like neuroimaging, is that if we could just take behavior at face value that's being generated by this box, this black box, and the black box is totally interpretable, which by definition it isn't, but let's suppose it were, then we would have our answer. But because this is, our sort of behavior is highly convoluted by what's happening inside that black box, it's hard to really kind of make that analogy between, say, the behavior of an agent and the behavior of a human, and then just by peering into the black box of the agent, say, okay, if we can just trace out that chain of things going on in that black box, we can achieve human-like behaviors or human-like competencies. And in other words, what I'm saying is that we don't understand how it happens in humans, so that kind of limits our ability to sort of know what's happening, or sort of approximate things in a model. In any case, so state-of-the-art approaches in machine learning, in some sense, has elided the problem of AI alignment altogether. So, for example, behavioral cloning is useful in practice because it does not require reward functions, but results in brittle AI systems that generalize poorly outside the training set. Similarly, reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, is very well in many applied settings, but outsources the evaluation of system outputs, and therefore the task of evaluating whether these outputs are aligned with human, and those are outsourced to human raters, so that goes outside of an artificial system to this highly subjective approach at rating things. Ratings may be appropriate to train models that need to be deployed in specific, narrowly defined use cases, but it does not get us any closer to achieving AI alignment. Neither does learning rewards from users by directly querying them about their preferences address the AI alignment problem, since we know from experimental psychology that self-report is a poor measure of actual performance. We suggest that progress can be made here by explicitly considering human evaluative systems and designing artificial agents that conform to the same principles. Over the past few decades, the fields of psychology and neuroscience have fundamentally reconsidered the nature of evaluative processes in the human brain. Rather than assuming that there exists a separate rational and emotion evaluative system, often assumed to correspond to model-based and model-free neural processes, experimental evidence suggests that affect is the core evaluative process, ubiquitous throughout the whole brain activity that we observe in neuroimaging. We have also learned that the sensory motor grounding for affect rests in interoception. We come to our decisions and select our actions on the basis of interoceptive beliefs, accountable to visosensory signals. So what they're getting at here is that, there's this sort of ancient assumption that emotion and cognition are separated out. So that there's this rational brain and there's this emotional brain and that there's no interaction between them. And that's kind of fallen by the wayside, as we know, that they're interacting systems. So a lot of decision making, for example, is influenced by emotion. So if you're in a certain emotional state, your decision making is impacted. If you're under stress, it's harder to come up with a good solution to a problem. If you're blinded by positive or negative emotions, it's harder to come up with the best answer to a problem. So that's what they're getting at with that. And this is something, of course, we don't really take into account with machine models. Machine models don't have that emotive or affective component, which is maybe interesting enough if you're comparing humans and machines, but you also have this aspect of kind of thinking about this regulatory system that is involved in affect. So, with Sennesh's work, he's interested in allostasis and emotions or affect and how those states, complex physiological states are regulated by affect. And so again, this is where you have this interaction between processes that you don't see in machine intelligence and machine decision making. Okay, so let's see. Here we propose that if we want AI agents to align with us, then it ought to follow that AI agents must model both the formation of affective states in humans and the interoceptive facts that ground these states. This proposed grounding may provide an inductive bias to overcome the negative identifiability results in alignment approaches such as cooperative reinforcement learning. Accordingly, this paper proposes an affectivist approach to AI alignment, and then they kind of talk about some of these things throughout the paper. So they kind of talk about the affective landscape Within the affective sciences, the affect gradient hypothesis suggests that gradients over a landscape of affective hills and valleys can point the way for all motivated behavior. So they use this sort of gradient descent like process for this sort of landscape model for looking at how how motivated behavior should unfold. So the hills and valleys are sort of these effects of affect and how they make motivated behavior harder or easier to achieve. And so this is a formalization of folk psychology or folk psychological intuition. As a brain basis for this hypothesis, the dopaminergic midbrain in vertebrates has long been studied as a brain basis for reinforcement learning. With such reinforcement learning, studies tend to assume that reward, which is the psychological and mathematical construct in reinforcement learning, corresponds linearly to reward that we see in neurobiology. So if we're talking about dopamine, that there's a sort of one-to-one correspondence between dopaminergic signaling and this rewarding behavior, and then having it be the psychological or mathematical construct. So, I guess what they're getting at is that you can increase or decrease the reward, and it will have an effect on behavior in the same way that, at least as it's thought of here, that you can increase or decrease dopaminergic signaling to get a certain reward behavior. Now, there are a number of problems with that. For one thing, we found that dopaminergic signaling is much more complex than more or less resulting in a certain behavior. There are a lot of interactions, and quite frankly, we don't fully understand the effects of dopamine signaling. But secondly, that it maps neatly to the construct that you're making of reward. So if you have a reinforcement learning model and you have reward for some output of a large language model, and you use that construct and you say you just increase the reward, what does that look like in the biological context? And how do you align that with human human response to rewards? Sometimes it's not obvious what the response to a reward is. If it's a weak reward, does it have a good response curve and things like that? While alternative models of dopaminergic midbrain have appeared in the literature, reinforcement learning formalizes the expected utility metaphor, which lacks interpretability because it systematically identifies mathematical functions of distal or sensory states of physical substances. So it's kind of an interesting aside, but in the history of behaviorism, which is where reinforcement learning originally came from, they would do a lot of different types of experiments where you would maybe give a monkey or a rat, some sort of reward like fruit juice, and you'd have this training, typically the sort of training regimen where they'd either get the fruit juice reward or not, and then that corresponds to this reward that we can quantify. And then this all kind of relates to dopaminergic midbrain signaling. So the midbrain, of course, not being the sort of seat of cognition, as it were, but rather a place where you get this clear response. It's kind of like, hey, this is what's happening in the dopaminergic midbrain. This is the sort of behavioral paradigm, and it's corresponding with some sort of improvement in behavior. So I'm rewarding it with a treat, the organism is responding, and we know this sort of idealized model system, and so this is how they should work. And then we take that as inspiration for our artificial model, which has all the properties of that kind of reward loop, but none of the sort of it doesn't take any of the biological responsibility, which means we don't understand the variation in it. We don't really understand where it can fail, or we don't really understand the sort of strength of rewards. So it's kind of an interesting aside. They say here, the problem here is not mathematical models of the mind, but rather their application to the study of motivated or goal-directed behavior without well-defined units. So again, this is like, we kind of take reinforcement learning as a artificial intelligence paradigm, takes inspiration from these kind of reinforcement learning experiments from behaviorism, and they don't translate the same units, they don't translate the same sort of mechanisms. Any interpretable model of biological systems behavior features well-defined units, or any interpretable model of biological systems behavior that features well-defined units must account for evolutionary history and natural selection. So in neuroscience and the cognitive sciences, this project takes the form of phylogenetic refinement. And this is Paul Cizek's idea of phylogenetic refinement. So this is the phylogenetic view of cognition, where things are sort of improved or optimized over evolution. So if you have like a lineage where you have some trait or some state that exists, it's refined throughout phylogeny. It's refined throughout evolution. It's refined throughout, the evolutionary history of lineage. That which was conserved through evolution by powerful selection pressures preventing deviation will tend to generalize across species, providing us with a historical inductive bias to understand that species-specific features emerge by elaboration and acceptation of what came before. So this leads us up to thinking about affect and the evolutionary function of valence, and the advantage of valence evolutionarily is to link an organism's internal physiology with the movement of its body through space via taxis navigation. Now we're getting into the taxis and how that relates to alignment, because we go from like this very simple model of reinforcement learning, which is an experimental model in neurobiology. So, it's something that we can elicit a response from. That's why we design experiments. So it may not relate directly to reward in sort of a naturalistic context. But then the point is that idealized biological model is then used. It's sort of artificialized into this reinforcement learning that we use today for reasoning, and we don't really have the same units of measurement. We're just kind of using a metaphor and attaching numbers to it. But then we have to think more deeply about sort of why something gets rewarded or why something is motivating to an organism. And that's where we get into these taxis and these kinds of concepts like valence and things like that. And so now we're talking about evolution. We're talking about why it's there and what it does. And so this is where we get into this whole discussion on these sort of, things that are well beyond computational reinforcement learning. And so, of course, it relates to the movement of the body, so it's related to embodiment and other things like that. So they point out that while elementary taxis navigation emerged quite early in single-cell organisms and was later replicated in multicellular animals, the earliest brains to feature taxi navigation or taxis navigation likely evolved in early bilaterians. And so this goes pretty deep into phylogeny, well before we had a midbrain. And so this is where we get this sort of this behavior that maybe we see in single-cell organisms, and then we start to see it in organisms with brains and then complex brains. And so this is something that is maybe an organizing principle of goal-directed behavior, these taxis. So you get taxis where, you're moving towards a sort of resource or a stimulus, and it's not dependent on any one neural architecture. It's certainly not dependent on dopaminergic signaling. It's dependent on some sort of movement towards a goal. And that can be implemented in a number of different ways, phylogenetically. We propose that once taxis navigation evolved to navigate a bilaterian's physical environment, the folding of the neural plate into a tube inside the organism reoriented the combined apical and blastoporal nervous systems towards navigating an internal taxis landscape. This is all described by Paul Cizik in his phylogenetic refinement paper. So this is where you have this transformation of single cells and the behavior of those single cells, I guess when they're connected, it reorients this nervous system, and you have what used to be external taxis in single cell organisms, now the sort of internal taxis in complex organisms with a nervous system, with specifically a neural tube, which would then later become a nervous system. So it's an interesting concept for these sort of internal taxis for affect, is that it started with like single cell taxis in the environment, where you have single cells that are moving towards food sources, chemical sources, light sources, or away from them. And then those things get repurposed by this sort of multicellularity, and then organization into a tissue, and organization into a network, and then this sort of folding and reshaping in development. And so this internal taxis landscape is prescribed movement through a vector space of viscerosensory physiological indicators, through interoceptive space. And so this is the heart of the Affect-Taxis hypothesis. We further suggest that the associative learning systems we typically consider the brain's reinforcement learning systems evolve later to invigorate or slow down taxis movement by estimating the long-run reward rate. This hypothesis could be checked neuroanatomically in mammals. Reward taxis models explain aspects of reward seeking in mice. So what he's saying is that, we have this sort of these internal taxis, which are these responses that are not well controlled. And then what he's saying is that any sort of reinforcement learning system in the brain really evolved to sort of regulate these taxic movements and estimate sort of a long-run reward rate. So instead of like having these internal taxis that are just kind of responsive to immediate stimuli or immediate internal state, you need to have a system that can like modulate that, but also estimate longer term rewards. So if you have a subject and you give it a juice box every time it does something interesting or good, then there's a sort of immediate sort of maximization of the reward. And so the reward, that's not necessarily a good thing. You need to have this sort of maybe longer, reward for longer term goals, or the ability to sort of seek out longer term goals for maybe a delayed reward. So, you have this distinction between always getting an immediate reward and always kind of having the system optimized or poised at that immediate reward versus seeking out longer term rewards and longer term equilibrium. So, unfortunately, in vertebrates such as mice and humans, associative reinforcement learning also ensures that behavior at any one moment does not reflect the immediate taxis landscape at the same moment. Instead, it reflects the predicted long-run taxis landscape given present sensory cues. So this is very much in the spirit of predictive processing. And so this is where you have this sort of prediction from present sensory cues to what this long-run landscape will look like. And so, again, I don't know why that's unfortunately, I guess, we can't, what they're saying is we can't make this direct, a direct connection between artificial systems and biological systems like humans in terms of how the reward structure works or is structured. To study taxis navigation as such rather than associative learning experimenters would either have to find a way to deactivate all learned associations while inhibiting their further learning, or study a model organism and simply wax temporal reinforcement learning while nonetheless performing taxis navigation and sharing a common ancestor with vertebrates. So they're actually thinking more about the sort of internal taxis and how those things work. But I think it has some relevance to the alignment problem too. Okay, so they kind of work through the math here. And so they define partially observed Markov decision processes, which are these environment models that they use. So at the level of RL simulation environments, frameworks such as the Farama Gymnasium could include taxis navigation or optimal foraging problems, including potentially by connecting with biophysical models of model organisms. Forage World, which is another package, provides an example of such an environment, as do DeepMind's rodent and swimmer environments. And these are these model gyms that we've talked about many times. Such an environment model would consist of a partially observable Markov decision process, or POMDP, as a standard in reinforcement learning. Okay, so then they kind of work through the POMDP example, and then they actually use C. elegans as a model organism's affective landscape. And so the computational study of affect remains in its infancy, with most studies focusing either on applying theories of emotion to theory of mind tasks or on the representation of emotion in AI models, rather than on formally modeling theories of how emotional and affective content arises in real brains. So we propose a computational model of a simple model organism engaging in whole body behavior to regulate its internal physiology and tie the biologically plausible components of that model to affect. So now we have a bilaterian model, which is C. elegans, and so taxis behavior in C. elegans is driven by a present stimulus, not a prediction or belief about possible future stimuli, bypassing the need to infer such beliefs from behavior. This section will describe what's already known about taxis and C. elegans. So it's true that C. elegans uses sort of an associative learning paradigm. So while C. elegans can learn to associate rewarding or punishing cues across sensory modalities, it does not associate them over time. So it doesn't have like a long-term memory of punishing and rewarding cues, at least according to the literature that they're citing. And then, so consider building the POMDP model proposed in section 3 for C. elegans. So we take the POMDP model and we apply it to C. elegans. Observations correspond to the signals transduced by taxis-related sensory and interoceptive neurons. So we have the sensory and interoceptive neurons, we have their circuits, and we can sort of use that as a model of taxis. It's interesting that in the DevaWorm meeting this week, I talked about a paper where they had explored this concept of sort of supporting circuits in the connectome. That is, we know that they're basic circuits for movement, that it consists of about 6 or 7 neurons, and that you can map these, you can simulate these circuits and map them to forward and backward movements. And they're very stereotype movements, and it's very precise. However, there is a lot of tuning in those movements, a lot of tuning of, like, you know, the speed of the worm and things like that. And those come from other neurons in the connectome and other parts of the connectome that feed into that circuit. So that circuit is basically operative at the level of giving basic commands, but there are also these supporting neurons that feed into the circuit that modulate it. So it's an interesting aside because I think they may be kind of hoping for a really simple model, and they may not have as simple of a model as they would like. In any case, it's far simpler than the dopaminergic midbrain, so there we go. The latter has been understood, and by latter they mean interoceptive neurons in this taxis-related aspect, is reading off the internal state of the organism to provide salience weights for different rewards and costs outside the body. So we have these, so actually we have this two-tiered system almost, where we have taxis in the external environment, and those are sensed by sensory neurons. And then we have interoceptive neurons with sense taxis in the interior. And then we can combine those into this sort of model of salience weights that characterize different rewards and costs. And so they work through their mathematical model here. There's a spatial gradient that provides a reference signal for taxis navigation, and kind of going through this whole thing. And so then they kind of get at like dopamine and serotonin and how those can play a role in these kind of reward signals and things like that. Okay. Reinforcement learning theories of the human brain tend to associate dopamine with reward prediction error, the invigoration of movement, and subjective arousal. Active inference models of vertebrate behavior cast dopamine as a precision parameter, measuring confidence in sensory cues about actions. So this leads to this sort of application of active inference based on what we know about dopamine being this reward prediction and mechanism and having this error that needs to be minimized. And then this is sort of the basis for the active inference model, which kind of models this minimizing this prediction error. This is all based on the human brain or in mammalian brains. In C. elegans, activating dopaminergic neurons makes worms slow down into a crawling gait and behave as if exploiting a patch of resources. While dopamine also serves as an essential role for controlling the speed or vigor of movement, as in vertebrates. We suggest here that, from an evolutionary perspective, dopamine controls the gain of proprioceptive feedback from motor movements to enable an organism to exploit opportunities in its nearby environment. So they made this connection between C. elegans and mammalian dopamine signaling and its role in behavior. And unlike some of the other cases in affect, you have this very clear signal from the signal. And it's, phylogenetically conserved, I guess is the way to put it. Less is known as a whole about the neural role of serotonin. So they had dopamine and then serotonin. They're looking at serotonergic activation in C. elegans. Serotonergic activation makes worms change their locomotory gait, as if leaving patches of resources. The sensory endings of these neurosecretory motor neurons located in the pharynx release serotonin when they sense food, leading to locomotor slowing, pharyngeal pumping, and eventually egg-laying behaviors. We suggest here that serotonin signals a shift from using the body to exploit environmental rewards to spending energy on the internal physiological processes requiring these rewards, tempering the taxis landscape to inhibit locomotion. So this is all about modeling arousal and then the behavioral output of it. So then they finally get into this discussion of AI alignment, discussing these Affective-Taxis and these other things, and kind of linking that to reinforcement learning, which would be the link between the two. So I think that's it. Building on recent work in affective science and computational modeling, this paper proposes an Affective-Taxis hypothesis of motivated behavior and ties it to interpretability and alignment of AI systems. Okay, so some really interesting references in here. We don't have time to go through them all, but a lot of references with respect to C. elegans and dopaminergic signaling and some other things about gradients and just a lot of good stuff. All right, Morgan, looks like you want to say some things.
It's a lot of what you, yeah, it's just like, hey, we've been using a mathematical abstraction of,
Yeah.
of what is reinforcement. Like again, like I always joke. People like, so are you like a machine learning person or something like that? And I said, well, I was certainly doing reinforcement learning back in the 90s. but I was doing it with animals.
Yeah.
Like, so, yes. Like, yeah. So, I mean, I like it. I thought it was interesting. Sorry, my image is getting cut off there. But the what's it called? Citation, connected papers. So you go to the archive, do connected papers,
Right.
and you get 3 distinct clusters. Which I think is, and you look at it, and it's a pretty good characterization of what that, it's got a it's talking about kind of like effective issues around effective taxis, another kind of like computational Bayesian modeling, and then like C. elegans.
Yeah.
And anyway, it's good. I think it should be coupled with this Carnegie Mellon professor who was I think the second last speaker, like a recent speaker in the the neuro group at Foresight, talking about how much information. Anyway, that was kind of like a theoretical paper. I mean, in terms of like a computer science limits of how much information needs to be exchanged for alignment between agents, right? Yeah. This yeah, I mean, interesting, trying to bring more biology, and biology can only be understood in the light of evolution. Right?
Yeah.
So like, and yeah, good stuff. Certainly, and Ramstead's name comes up a bunch.
Right.
I was, I know we got to go, but I meant to post this, but like there's an RX infer. Let me just see if I can find it right before we go. Let me see. Maybe it was from Lazy Dynamics. Yeah, okay. Oh, well, this is an old paper. Sorry. Anyway, this is trying to computationally link active inference to a Tenenbaum, a 2023 Tenenbaum paper about from words to world models, or from word models to world models. I don't know if my pronunciation is getting that across.
Okay.
WORD to WRLD.
Yeah.
And not that this is the same thing, but just more realistic realism. It's so also interesting, like the benchmark suites, or not the benchmark suite, but the environments that they're using, right? Yeah. And so I didn't get to talk about the Neurotech Summit that was this week.
Okay.
The very short update on this was there was no Neurotech Summit.
What?
It was a 4-hour pitch session.
Oh.
To Protocol Labs Neuro.
Okay.
Which was super interesting in that there was a series of what I would call senior brain initiative researchers pitching.
Yeah.
And as I joked to someone, it was just like everybody in that room was already on my Google Scholar alert list.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
It was just sad that they were all looking for alternative funding because Brain Initiative in their minds has been, is effectively closed.
Yeah.
But why I bring it up is that there was a consistent, for like Sean Escola and Patrick Manel were the two judges, if you will, or they were who you were pitching to, and their consistent kind of follow-up question across these researchers' pitches was about the environmental complexity that you could achieve. So this is like how are you making the environment more naturalistic?
Right.
Right. I mean, so many neuropixels, like neuropixels were present, in probably 50% of the pitches. If the pitch wasn't about starting to use them, then the pitch was like, because we've been looking at neuropixels. Right. like either doing something new past it or like some new application of it. But a real, like a pretty common follow-up was just about how well you how naturalistic, just that, like you could make things, and which again, I mean, played a bit into this kind of active inference way of thinking of things, where that loop about from the animal to the world and is much richer and not necessarily more complex, but needs to be treated with a bit more fidelity. Right. And which is sort of similar to the mice don't just maximize pellets, or like it's not you can't just have a light go on and a pellet respond and feel like you've really captured what's going on. Anyway, I'll follow up, or like it would be good to cover some more of those examples of, because it really was an interesting, like, you get to be in the room when a bunch of senior people are kind of pitching for, like it was kind of good that they weren't R01s.
Yeah.
You know, like they were small, but they weren't trivial. Kind of cared about open science.
Yeah.
And kind of cared about open science, open source, and a little bit like will this help other people's research? Not can you do something that then like a bunch of people can build on?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's exactly open science, but like I'll stop.
All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for attending, and hopefully this meeting was useful. I guess it was.
Oh yeah, for sure. Anyway, we gotta start helping with the hackathon here.
All right.
So buy a punk hackathon.
All right. Good luck. Thanks.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.